Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This one is going to be tough, I think. We're going to be looking at the plane crash in Washington, D.C. just a couple days ago. It's January 30th as we record this, and it's a real tragedy. There are a lot of people searching for answers, and we're going to do our best to try to piece together what we know so far.
What's really striking about this particular crash is that it involves a collision. You don't see that very often. It's not just a single aircraft incident. We're talking about two aircraft that collided in midair. So that adds a whole other layer of complexity to the investigation, as you can imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like trying to solve two puzzles at once, right?
Precisely. So before we dive into any hypotheses or start speculating too much, I think it's helpful to just kind of set the scene, lay out the basic facts for everyone.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so on January 30th, an American Airlines Bombardier CRJ-700 collided with a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter near Reagan National Airport.
Tragically, both aircraft crashed into the Potomac River.
That's right. And all 67 people aboard, that includes 64 on the plane and 3 on the helicopter, lost their lives.
It's just heartbreaking to think about the human cost.
Yeah.
Reading about some of the victims there were promising young figure skaters from the U.S. and Russia. There were people traveling from all over Kansas, the Philippines, Germany, even China. And then you read the individual stories, and it's even more poignant. One of the pilots was engaged to be married. A flight attendant had a daughter who was about to get married. And one of the soldiers on the helicopter, Ryan O'Hara, had a 1-year-old son. It really hits home that this isn't just about data points or statistics. It's about lives that have been shattered.
Yeah, it is. And it's really important as we, try to dissect and understand how this happened to keep that in mind. So with that said, I guess the first question is, where do things stand with the investigation right now? What do we know?
Well, I know that they've recovered both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder from the plane, the so-called black boxes. That's always a critical step, right?
It is, yeah. The black boxes are kind of like a plane's diary. They record everything that's happening during the flight, from cockpit conversations to engine performance, altitude, speed. All that data is captured by those boxes. And it gives investigators a second-by-second account of what was happening in those final moments leading up to the crash.
So the NTSB, that's the National Transportation Safety Board, right? Like the FBI for plane crashes, they are currently analyzing those black boxes.
Yeah, that's right.
And we should have at least a preliminary report within 30 days.
Exactly. And, in the meantime, while we wait for that report, I think there are a few other pieces of this puzzle that we can start to look at. And one that really stands out to me is the airport itself, Reagan National. As many of our listeners might know, it's known to be a particularly challenging airport for pilots.
Why is that?
Well, you've got busy runways, limited space, and then on top of that, you've got all this restricted airspace because of its proximity to the White House and the Pentagon.
Right, so these pilots basically have to thread the needle to land there.
Exactly. It's almost like, imagine, navigating through a tight maze with high-speed traffic all around you. Pilots landing at Reagan National have to be incredibly precise with their navigation. And then on top of that, you've got this incredibly crowded airspace around D.C. with both military and commercial aircraft operating in close proximity. It creates a very complex and demanding environment for everyone involved.
I hadn't really considered that before. So we've got this already challenging environment, and then we add in the fact that military and civilian aircraft can't communicate directly because they use different radio frequencies.
That's right. It's kind of a, protocol that aims to minimize radio chatter, but it can also create a situation where pilots aren't fully aware of each other's movements in real time. And in this case, you have the helicopter crew was wearing night vision goggles. They were on a training flight with an instructor pilot in command.
Wow. Interesting. And one thing that really surprised me when I was reading about this was that a single air traffic controller was managing both the planes and the helicopters that night.
Yeah, that was it was considered unusual. It was described as not normal, but acceptable because of, lower traffic volume that night. But still, it does raise some questions.
Wait, a single controller? Given everything we've just learned about Reagan National, that's kind of blowing my mind. And didn't you mention earlier that there's actually a shortage of air traffic controllers nationwide?
That's right. Yeah, the FAA has about 3,000 fewer controllers than they say they actually need, which means that many facilities are relying on controllers working mandatory overtime and 6-day work weeks.
Wow.
So you've got this incredibly demanding job in this high-pressure environment, and you're short-staffed. So fatigue, definitely something that investigators will be looking into.
Yeah, it seems like they've got a lot to consider as they try to piece together what happened.
They do, and there are a few specific details about the crash itself that I think raise some additional questions.
Like,
Well, one is the issue of the helicopter's altitude. The military has stated that the maximum altitude for the helicopter's route was 200 feet. But data suggests that the collision actually occurred at around 300 feet. So we're talking about the height of about a 30-story building here. That's quite a discrepancy.
yeah, it is. That's a huge difference.
Yeah.
Now, I know you mentioned earlier that the helicopter crew was wearing night vision goggles and they were on a training flight. But do we have any information on why they might have deviated so far from their assigned altitude?
Not yet. That's one of the key questions that investigators are trying to answer. Could it have been pilot error, a miscommunication with air traffic control,
Mm-hmm.
an equipment malfunction? All those possibilities are on the table at this point. And hopefully, the recording devices on the helicopter will shed some light on that. The Army has actually grounded all flights from that unit while they reevaluate training exercises in the region. So they're definitely taking it very seriously.
It's hard to believe that something like this could happen in such a tightly controlled airspace, you know? It makes you wonder if there's some maybe larger systemic issues at play here.
That's a valid point, I think.
Yeah.
It's important to remember, though, the goal here isn't to assign blame prematurely. It's to really try to understand what happened and to identify any potential weaknesses in the system that might have contributed to this tragedy.
Yeah, that's true. So besides the black boxes, besides the ongoing investigation, are there any other clues that might help us understand what happened?
Well, there are the air traffic control recordings. These recordings capture the final communications between air traffic control and the helicopter. And, it's chilling to hear the controller alerting the helicopter pilot about the approaching jet, instructing him to change course. And then just moments later, you hear another pilot calling in saying, "Tower, did you see that?"
Wow. It's almost like you're listening to a movie, except this is real life, and the stakes couldn't be higher.
And the controller's response is truly haunting. You hear him say, "I just saw a fireball," and then it was just gone. It sends chills down your spine just thinking about it.
It really does.
Yeah.
So those recordings give us a glimpse into those final moments before the crash. And they're going to be absolutely crucial for investigators as they try to reconstruct the events that led up to the collision. Okay, so it's a lot to process. We've got all these different potential contributing elements. Where do we even begin to unravel all of this?
Well, I think it's helpful to kind of approach it like a puzzle.
Mm.
We have these pieces of evidence, the black boxes, the recordings, the airport's layout, the air traffic control protocols. And the NTSB is going to meticulously try to fit all those pieces together to explain what happened.
Okay, so let's start putting those pieces together then. Let's delve into some of these potential contributing factors in a little more detail. What are some of the key areas that investigators are going to be focusing on?
Well, as we've touched on, the fact that a single air traffic controller was managing both planes and helicopters that night, that's definitely raised some eyebrows, especially given the shortage of controllers nationwide.
Yeah, it's a valid concern. Think about it. They're responsible for monitoring multiple aircraft simultaneously, making sure they're maintaining safe distances, guiding them through these specific flight paths, all while communicating clearly and concisely. It's like conducting an orchestra, but instead of instruments, you're dealing with, tons of metal hurtling through the air at hundreds of miles per hour.
Yeah. And then you layer on top of that the pressure of working those long hours, maybe feeling that strain of being short-staffed. I mean, no wonder that fatigue is being considered as a potential factor in this crash.
Right. Fatigue can significantly impair judgment and reaction time. And, studies have shown that even a small amount of sleep deprivation can have the same effect as being legally intoxicated. So you can imagine the impact that could have in a high-stakes job like air traffic control. Yeah, that's a chilling thought. So fatigue, the single controller, those are definitely pieces of this puzzle. What about the helicopter's altitude? Any theories on why it was flying so much higher than it was permitted to?
Well, one theory is that the pilots might have misjudged their altitude because of the use of those night vision goggles. While those goggles can enhance visibility in low light conditions, they can also distort depth perception and make it harder to judge distances accurately.
So they might have thought they were lower than they actually were.
Exactly. And with Reagan National's restricted airspace, even a small miscalculation like that could have put them on a collision course with the jet.
Wow. It's a sobering reminder that even advanced technology has its limitations.
It is, and it highlights the importance of, thorough training and procedures to try to mitigate those limitations as much as possible.
Speaking of procedures, I was reading that military and civilian aircraft can't communicate directly because they operate on different radio frequencies. So is that something that could have played a role here?
It's definitely a factor investigators will be looking at. While that protocol, again, is meant to reduce radio congestion, it can also create a situation where pilots are essentially flying blind to each other's movements,
Yeah.
Imagine driving on a highway where you can only see the cars in your immediate vicinity, but not those further down the road.
It's terrifying.
Yeah, it's kind of like that for these pilots trying to navigate this shared airspace without that direct communication.
Yeah, that makes those air traffic control recordings even more
Uh,
crucial, right?
yeah.
Because they might be the only record of what those pilots knew and when they knew it.
Exactly. They could reveal whether the air traffic controller tried to warn the helicopter pilot about the approaching jet or if there was any indication that the pilots were aware of the impending danger.
It's almost like listening for those critical missing pieces of the conversation, trying to understand how this whole tragedy unfolded, and to think all this is happening against the backdrop of this incredibly busy airport with its unique layout, its restricted airspace.
You know, Reagan National's location is a significant challenge for pilots. I mean, it's surrounded by some of the most restricted airspace in the country. You've got no-fly zones around the White House, the Capitol building, the Pentagon. So all of this forces aircraft into very specific flight paths. Essentially creates a bottleneck in the sky.
It's like trying to squeeze a lot of traffic through a very narrow channel.
Exactly. And that's why investigators are going to be meticulously analyzing the flight paths of both aircraft, looking for any signs of deviation, miscommunication, human error, anything that might have contributed to this collision.
Yeah, it's like they're retracing those final moments step by step, trying to understand how those two aircraft ended up in the same space at the same time.
And, every detail matters. The weather conditions, the pilot's experience levels, the maintenance records of the aircraft, all of these factors could potentially have played a role, however small. It's a complex investigation, but the NTSB is known for its thoroughness. So hopefully we'll get some answers.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. I think it's so important that we do get those answers,
Yeah.
not just for the families of the victims, but for the entire aviation community.
Absolutely. Understanding what caused this crash could lead to changes in procedures, technology, training that could prevent something like this from happening again.
Right. So it seems like with all of these factors in play, there are a lot of potential explanations for what happened. Is it too early to start forming any conclusions?
I think it's really important to avoid speculation until the NTSB releases its findings, but we can certainly look at the evidence we have and consider some possible scenarios.
Okay, let's do that. Let's put on our detective hats and walk through some of those scenarios.
Yeah.
What are some of the most likely explanations based on what we know so far?
Well, one possibility is that the helicopter pilots, potentially disoriented by their night vision goggles, strayed too high into the path of that approaching jet.
So a tragic combination of human error and maybe those technological limitations.
It's possible. Another scenario could involve a miscommunication between the air traffic controller and the helicopter pilot, perhaps due to that lack of direct communication between military and civilian aircraft that we talked about earlier.
So the controller might have been trying to warn the helicopter, but the message either wasn't received or wasn't understood in time.
That's another possibility that investigators will be exploring. And of course, we can't rule out the possibility of a mechanical failure on either aircraft. Modern aircraft are incredibly reliable, but they are still complex machines with thousands of moving parts.
Right, and even a small malfunction could have catastrophic consequences, especially in such a congested airspace.
Exactly. It's like a chain reaction. One small error or malfunction can trigger a series of events that ultimately lead to a disaster.
It is a sobering thought. But
Yeah.
as we kind of delve deeper into this investigation, I think it's important to remember that these aren't just abstract scenarios. They represent the final moments of 67 people's lives.
You're absolutely right, and that's why we need to approach this with sensitivity and respect, even as we try to understand the technical and procedural aspects of this crash.
Speaking of respect, I know there's been some political commentary swirling around this event, but I think it's important for us to really focus on the facts and the victims.
I agree. This is a time for mourning, for understanding, and for working towards a safer future for everyone who flies.
Yeah, well said. Now, I know we've been really focusing on the potential causes of the crash, but I think it's important to take a moment to remember those who were lost and acknowledge the profound impact that this tragedy has had on their families and their communities.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Let's shift our focus to the human side of this story and hear some of the stories of those whose lives were cut short that day.
Yeah, it's hard to grasp the immensity of the loss, 67 lives, each representing a world of their own.
It really is. It's easy to get caught up in the technical details and the procedures and all of that. But ultimately, this is about people. Mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, friends, colleagues, all gone in an instant.
I was reading about Sam Lilly, the first officer on the American Airlines flight. He was engaged to be married later this year. And his father, who is also a pilot, said, "I was so proud when Sam became a pilot. Now it hurts so bad I can't even cry myself to sleep."
Oh, that's just heartbreaking. And then you have Ian Epstein, a flight attendant on that same flight. His ex-wife described him as someone who loved his job and really made flying fun for the passengers. He always tried to put them at ease, cracking jokes, making the announcements with a little twist. He leaves behind 2 daughters, one of whom is getting married in just a few weeks.
Yeah, that's got to be so difficult for his family, trying to celebrate such a joyous occasion with this immense grief weighing on them. And we can't forget about Ryan O'Hara, the soldier on the Black Hawk helicopter. He was a member of the ROTC in high school, and he had a wife and a 1-year-old son.
Yeah, his former ROTC program posted a tribute online. They said, Ryan is fondly remembered as a guy who would fix things around the ROTC gym, as well as a vital member of the rifle team. Clearly, a dedicated young man with a bright future ahead of him.
These stories are so incredibly moving, and they really bring home the human cost of this tragedy, and there are so many more like them. Azra Hussein Raza, she was a 26-year-old woman traveling for work. She texted her husband saying she'd land in 20 minutes, but that was the last he ever heard from her.
It's just unimaginable. Her father-in-law said, Azra was everything to us, and now my son is a widower at 25.
It's a stark reminder that behind every statistic, every news headline, there are real people whose lives are forever changed by events like this.
And it's not just the immediate families who are affected. It's their friends, their communities, their colleagues. This ripple effect of grief and loss, it will be felt for years to come.
As we kind of wrap up this deep dive, I keep coming back to the question, what happens now?
Sure.
We have the ongoing investigation, all these potential contributing factors, a nation grappling with this tragedy. What are your thoughts?
Well, the NTSB will continue to do their meticulous work analyzing the evidence and hopefully providing some answers. But beyond that, I think it's really up to all of us to learn from this, to ask the tough questions, to demand accountability, and to advocate for changes that can make our skies safer.
Yeah, for our listeners, I think it's worth reflecting on what we've learned today and considering what changes, if any, should be implemented at Reagan National Airport or within the FAA to prevent something like this from happening again.
Yeah.
This isn't just some abstract policy issue. This is about real lives.
I agree. And it's a conversation that needs to continue. We owe it to the victims, to their families, and to ourselves to make sure that something positive comes out of this tragedy.
This has been a difficult deep dive, but a necessary one. Thank you for joining us as we explored this complex and heartbreaking event.
And to everyone listening, please continue to learn about this story as new information emerges. Read the reports, consider different perspectives, and stay engaged in the conversation about aviation safety.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.